this is an arena that, as a pastor of a predominantly white church, the arena for you is about listening and being taught, and I guess educating ourselves, correct?
Yeah, I think what we were just talking about was being at a march, kind of a march and rally that was held downtown recently, in the wake of the George Floyd death, the murder of George Floyd, and we were talking about how it was a predominantly white crowd, but the leaders were people of color representing various ethnicities and races, and we were being led, we were being allowed to listen. And I think that's important, and I should be careful about that word, allowed. We're being intentional about listening is really the word that I'm looking for. And I think that's an important step. I think the white community needs to allow itself to be led in this situation.
To step back.
To step back, to listen, and to ask, to our conversation, to ask, how can I be an ally? Some people are encouraging us not just to be allies, but to be what they're calling co-conspirators, or, how do we walk alongside in really significant and meaningful ways that matter, but allow us. We need to be careful about how we interject ourselves into that situation, I think.
And that's what we were talking about. This is the moment for us to listen, for us to be taught, for us to educate ourselves. And this is a space, as a white ally, that you've been in before. And let's talk about your experience in Alabama, and then we'll talk about what parishioners in your church are doing that they can do to self-educate as well. But you've been in this space before. Tell me about your experience in Alabama.
Yeah, so just straight out of graduate school, straight out of seminary, my wife and I went to school in Connecticut. I took a position in Alabama and pastored a church there. And again, as you would expect, that church was predominantly white in the Deep South, and issues of race were, I was not prepared for it, honestly. It was just, I had never lived in the Deep South. I had never understood that. I think I had some ideas of what it might be like, but I wasn't prepared for how it is just so again, this is 20 years ago. But at that point, in many ways, it was just so steeped into the culture that I felt out of my depth pretty quickly. It was, of course, even speaking a voice of anti-racism, pro-reconciliation, talking about the brokenness of race, talking about the systemic nature of it, how it just infuses itself into people and into communities, and how the Christian church has a responsibility for stepping into that and saying no. Again, it's not enough just to not be racist. Christians are called to be anti-racist. And in Montgomery, it is amazing to be in a community that has such rich history. So my wife actually pastored, she is also white, she actually pastored a church that was predominantly black in between Selma and Montgomery. And many of its members were a part of the march from Selma to Montgomery. And that church was a part of that in a very intentional and meaningful way. And so that part of it is rich. And it was very powerful to meet with people who were part of the movement and to learn from them and to be inspired by them. And so that part was very, very rich. And we formed some wonderful relationships there. And the particular denominational, the region of our denomination that was there was very, the relationship building there was very, very good. Mm-hmm. It was intentional, it was effective, it was meaningful, it was great. But again, and there were many white folk who were on the right path and working toward this as well. But there was also a significant portion of people who were very resistant to what I would call equity and inclusion.
So what was your takeaway from that experience for both you and your wife, Carrie?
Again, I think part of the takeaway was, I think we are very easy and quick to quote this idea that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, right? We know that King talked about that, and we know that that's been something that people have looked toward. And I believe that. But I also believe that when you're part of a community that experienced injustice and oppression, the arc is taking too long, and I think that's what we felt, is to be there in the late 90s, early 2000s, and to experience what we experienced, the language, the just overt descriptions of bigotry and prejudice. We could not believe that in the late 90s that's where we still were. And for me, it felt like that arc had been pressed further back. And so as we took away from that was, we have come far, but we have so much further to go. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that. This is a very recent past.
Well, and I was going to say fast forward 20 years, but it's almost like, really? Here we still are. So that's what I mean, the progress, my guess is there might be a little frustration still that really, that we're here again, we're still, or really,
yeah.
We're still here.
Right, yeah, right. No, yeah, we're still here. Yeah, we're not here again, we're still here. These issues are still in our midst, and still very concerning. I do think we are moving, and I think that there are signs of that, and that is good, and there is an awakening that seems to be happening recently that is good. I don't know why it was I don't know why it was George Floyd. I don't know why that was the moment. I know many people have asked that question, but something happened there. It was like a tipping point, and it revealed a reality that was already in existence in a way that has reignited or shine a light onto something that's always been there, but the conversation has definitely regained some traction.
And I think we all are kind of in the same space, for the most part people are, that it can never go back to the way it was. There is change that will be happening with police reforms and different things like that. Your perspective on that with the sermon recently, I thought was really interesting. The space you're in, I think it was your stepfather who was a police officer. You have adopted a black son. That puts you in a really unique space. Talk about that a little bit and what you feel from that.
Yeah, so my parents divorced when I was young, and when my mother remarried, she married a police officer, and absolutely just wonderful human being who took me in as his own. I had a great relationship with my biological father, but my stepfather was just very engaged, very loving, very present, just a wonderful person. It could not have been a better thing for me as a child growing up. And one of my greatest fears was that he wouldn't come home after a shift, that we had finally we've had someone come into our family who we loved and who loved us, and he served as a police officer, and I was so worried that he wouldn't come home. And what I wanted more than anything was for him to come home safely when I was a child. And I remember in my childhood thinking, very simplistic thinking, I didn't care what it took for him to get home. It was, if it had to be him or anyone else, I wanted it to be him. And that's where I was. I just thought he was great, couldn't imagine my life without him, and was worried about that. Well, again, fast forward. My wife and I began our family planning with an intentional adoption, and we were willing to adopt a child of any racial, ethnic background. We were open to that. What we learned in the process is that multiracial children, at least at that point, were among the hardest to find adoptive placements. Our son is multiracial. He is African American, Mexican American, and Caucasian and white. His presentation in the world is African American. He's dark skin, dreadlocks. So I think when people see him, their first impression is of African American. And so now, as he has turned into, especially as he has grown and moved into teenage years, and now he's 20, so young adulthood, my fears have shifted. I want nothing more than for him to come home. And I'm concerned that his name is going to be on a list that's already far too long, and it terrifies me. I don't care what the cost is. I need him to come home. And so I feel like I stand between these two communities because what I learned from having a parent who is in law enforcement and knowing the people who worked with him in law enforcement who were also just wonderful people. And when I see the stresses and the pressures and the things that they are under and the way that people talk about them, and there are times I really want to stand with them. I think if a police officer abuses his or her authority, if they abuse their power, whatever that may be, they need to be held accountable for that. And I think there's some reform in policing that needs to take place. But I see them, and I worry about them, and I care for them, and there are times I want to stand with them. At the same time, I've got an African American son who is a black man. And I see him, and I see those who have, African American men and women who have experienced racism the way he has experienced it. And I want to stand with them. And I know it's more complicated than this issue between our African American community and policing. It's more broad than that, but it does get boiled down to those two things so often.
Versus them,
Us versus
when
them.
you find that a lot of people live in between.
Yeah, a lot of us live in between, and we're torn. It's just a hard place to be. It's a really, really hard place to be.
In that upbringing with your son, though, you witnessed things. So I'm assuming just with what you said, with everything that you saw in Alabama in your time there, wasn't a huge shock, or maybe it was, I don't know. Was it different when you saw it from that view, though, of your son?
Yeah, I think it is different. There is no comparison to being the parent of an African American child to being that African American child. I have not walked in his shoes. I have not experienced everything that he has experienced. I think and there are stories. Without question, there are stories. But I think the comment that he made that just broke my heart wide open to the realities of his life. He was still living at home in high school, and there was an issue at the high school around race. And we were talking about it, and I said to him, Son, I am so sorry that you are having to deal with this. It's wrong, it's heartbreaking, I hate it for you, I wish this didn't exist, and I'm so sorry. And his response was to say, it's okay, Dad, I'm used to it. And I'll tell you what, I was able to keep my composure as I talked with him, but then I needed to go spend some time alone because it just broke me wide open. I think he was 16 at the time. Nobody should be used to that. Everybody's reaction should be that's heartbreaking and horrible and terrible.
Completely wrong.
But by the age of his mid-teens, he'd experienced enough of it to say, Dad, I'm used to it. It doesn't bother me the way it used to bother me. I'm used to it. In all the things that we experienced, it was his verbalizing the normalization of his experience of being a person of color that it just broke me apart. No one should be used to that.
As a parent, you want to be protective. And then there it is, and you're going, no one should ever be used to that. He shouldn't be subjected to that.
No, it was just absolutely heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. But again, it points to the reality of how pervasive this is. This is not a. I think sometimes folks assume that this is an overreaction. You didn't understand that, you didn't experience that, you're reading it wrong, No, this is pervasive, and people are dealing with this all the time.
So as a pastor, how do you take that to your congregation that is predominantly white, and say, this is on us. This is on us to learn, this is on us to change, this is on us to call it out. How do you do that? I know you've got a class coming up we want to talk about. And how do you do it in a way that everything is politicized nowadays? And is that a problem in churches? I don't know.
I do think it's a problem in churches. I think in a lot of ways, white Christian churches have been complicit in the continuing systemic problem of race and racism and bigotry. I don't think we've always been helpful for that. But I think, and I certainly think that racism is antithetical to the gospel. There's no question about that, and that is clear. But I don't think this issue is unique to the church. I do think that that issues of white hesitation and the difficulty of the white community to hear and accept this are very real. And it is hard for, even when I share stories about our experience and our son's experience and what happened, if I share them in a sermon or I share them in a class or share them in a conversation, I will still almost every single time have someone press back and say, that I'm sure you read that wrong. You are being too sensitive. What you that could not have possibly been their meaning. I think you're overreacting. And what I think there's so many things that are troubling about that. I think it's for whatever reason there is a barrier for people to accept the reality that this stuff happens.
I guess we have to look in the mirror and not like what we see. Is
And
that
that's
part of it?
Absolutely, it's part of it. And I think there's a growing number of people who are talking about that.
But again, we always go back to, and what you hear so much now, and I keep saying it because it resonates so much, is, you know, you can't have reconciliation if you don't have the truth. And if you don't face the truth, there will never be reconciliation.
This is so true. You've put this perfectly. You have got to have truth first before there is reconciliation. And truth has got to include confession. And we've got this tendency to want to say, I'm not racist. I was not a part of that. I am not responsible for that. I understand why people say those things. I think that they're not fully informed statements, and I hope that there's a greater awakening for why that's true, why they're not fully informed statements. But there is a tremendous resistance sometimes for us to own our own role and responsibility in what is happening. And so whether it's in the church or outside the church, getting the white community to be in a place of doing what you said, hearing that truth and accepting it as truth, and then being able to move towards reconciliation. We're not even here yet. We're struggling to accept what we hear and what we see as true, and we're very, very quick to look for an explanation or a reason. Very quick. We always want to explain away the racism or the violence or the actions of officers or the public or whatever it may be. We're looking for reasons to explain that away very, very quickly. And I think that's a symptom of this hesitancy to deal with the underlying truth that may be there that we may not like.
Let's talk about the class that some of your parishioners, that you've had other classes on racism. This is different. These are things that people can read in your church and kind of self-educate?
Yeah, so I think that this is what I've come to through this. While I think there needs to be direct conversation, and I think there needs to be, in the language of the church, we use a prophetic voice. There needs to be some calling out. There needs to be some truth telling, whether people are receptive to that or open to that. There needs to be some real open dialogue about that. There needs to be some naming. That has to happen. But those kinds of things don't seem to be moving us the way we need to be moved. And I think the only way we're going to get that movement to really happen is for people to do their own work. I've got a friend who does a lot of equity and inclusion work with corporations. And I was talking with her about this some time ago, about the work that she does. And she said one of the challenges in communities and in corporations and businesses when we talk about equity work or when we talk about racism, we talk about doing that, is they want to jump to the whiteboard and they want to solve it. They want solutions. They want to get to the solution before doing the hard work. And they need to do the hard work. And I think sometimes we want to move past that hard work and jump to what we think are solutions. But they're not solutions if the underlying issues are not dealt with. And one of the things that we've done in the white community, I think with well-intentioned, but wrong-headed, and I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here, we need to listen to the voices of the marginalized. We need to listen to the voices of Black, Indigenous people of color, of African Americans, of other ethnic and racial groups. We need to listen to them, and we need to be in dialogue with them. But I think one of the things that we've done as the white community is we've wanted them to do the heavy lifting, to come and teach us about racism, to come and talk to us about how we want them to come and do the work for us.
They're tired,
They're-
and
they're-
they will say that.
they're
It's not my
exhausted.
job to teach you.
It is not my job to teach you. And what I've discovered when we've done that, and I have been guilty of this, is that there's that resistance. And people can walk away and go, I don't know, I think that person was overreacting. It's because they haven't done the work yet, and it's easy to dismiss something that isn't the work you need to do. It is not their responsibility to get us there. And I think the thing to remember is, it's not just, I mean, they're suffering, and they're suffering more than I am, and my son suffers more than I do, and I get that. It diminishes all of our lives. It diminishes all of our communities, regardless of what race we may be. Any kind of racism and injustice, it diminishes everyone's experience of life and community. So what I think we're trying to do with this class is to allow individuals to do the work on their own. And so rather than saying we're all going to read this one book and we're going to talk about it, there's a selection of resources. And it comes from an approach that's called a scaffolded study. And so it starts with easier to access and kind of engage with materials, and then moves. I think one of the challenges that we have today is there's some tremendous work being done and books being written that I think we should all read. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates just is a great example of that. But that's a work that sometimes folks jump into, or Ibram Kendi. Mm-hmm. Folks jump into that work they jump into that work before doing some of the baseline work, and then they get resistant to what they're hearing Ibram Kendi say, and they push away from that. So what this is designed to do is to start a little bit. Safer is not the word, because there is no safe space. I've stopped using that word. I've been corrected by that. It's brave and vulnerable space. It's stepping into a space and allowing something to break into us that's going to open us up to a truth that we may have wanted to deny. And so all of this is individual work. And people have got to do that work on their own. They've got to do, as you said, look in the mirror. Mm-hmm. And I think my role as pastor is to hold them accountable to that work. And they're going to do that work at different pace. But if there's authenticity and effort and intention about that work, then I think it may start to break through. I think that's been my experience. I'm still on the journey. I've still got work to do. But the more I've allowed little things to break through and open me to the reality of really what's going on, it's allowed me to hear the truths that I was once resistant to.
Right.
That's the hope of this. So we start simple. We start basic. One of the steps that we're taking, we're going to be talking about a book called Whistling Vivaldi, where this guy talks about stereotype threat. And I think the reason they've put this at the first step of this is everyone has probably experienced stereotype. And in fact, the premise of the book is, you have experienced this. Women have experienced it. Police officers have experienced it. Clergy have experienced it. Southerners have experienced it. Prejudice is something that we've all engaged to. And prejudice is different than racism. It is not equal. That is not what this work is saying. But what it's saying is, in that moment when we've experienced that, we've experienced the injustice of being unrightly, having things attributed to us incorrectly and unfairly, and how that impacts us. And sometimes we even start to believe them. And when we do, that stereotype takes root. That stereotype threat takes root. And so if we can in any way begin to find, what's the word I'm looking for? If there's any way we can begin to find empathy through that experience, because sometimes I think even when we talk about our own experiences, I know I've talked with many of my female colleagues who have expressed instances of sexism in church boards and in congregations and in things like that. When we hear those stories and we begin to believe those stories and understand those stories, then it opens us up to understanding the truth of other stories that are equally hard to hear,
right?
That we may have pressed back against. And I think there's real value to that. But if we jump from the starting point to if we jump too far, I think and that foundation isn't there.
You don't want to lose them in that journey.
I don't want to lose them in the journey because I think we start to press back, and I think people want to hit the eject button because it's just too hard.
What would you say to other churches? I mean, I know that this is a very personal thing with you and your church, but I'm assuming that you're hoping, and you see more and more where there tend to be many churches now in this, which has been the case many times with the civil rights movement. I guess to encourage other white allies to do the same?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's some wonderful resources out there, and there's some tools that people can use. And when we jumped into this has been work that I've always been engaged in to some degree throughout the course of my 20 plus year congregational ministry, life in congregational ministry. I think sometimes we don't jump into something because we're afraid we're not going to do it perfectly. And we're going to make mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. And sometimes out of fear of imperfection or fear of offense or fear of getting it wrong, we freeze. Well, maybe we need to practice the grace that we preach so often and say, hey, let's jump in, let's do this work even if it's imperfect, because we've got to be doing this work. It is not going to solve itself. It just isn't.
I think with that too, with things that I keep hearing, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's kind of the new place where we are in order to do this kind of work.
Yeah, which is really why I like the language of this is brave space, not safe space.
Right.
There is no such thing as safe space. If you're gonna do hard work, you've got to be vulnerable. You've got to lean in. You've got to allow yourself to. I think Brene Brown, the language she used is soft front, hard back. You've got to be willing to stand up and move into it, but you've got to allow yourself some softness to be engaged in that process. It's essential, but we've got to get used to being uncomfortable. This sounds. We have got to get to a place where we believe the stories we are being told. If we cannot believe the stories that we're being told, if we can't get to that truth and accept it as truth, we are never going to get there. And I think, Rachel, I'm not sure how we do that. I'm not sure how we get people to believe that this is happening.
And I go back to the George Floyd because I think that was the tipping point. There was no more denial. It was on video for the world to see. There was no denying what happened in that video. Yeah. And I think at a time when there was COVID and all eyes were on it, there was no turning away. Yeah. There were no distractions. And I think that if we could not deny that.
We can't, we could see it.
And I don't know if that was that moment that made that what it was.
I think you may be onto something, because you certainly can't deny it. I think that many folk who saw that are still wondering why it was that, because they've seen so much evidence and so many cases leading up to that, thinking, look, something's not right here, and it just kind of not sparking the same kind of issue. But you're right, all eyes were definitely on this.
It was just
we were there. The timing was there, and I'm in that regard. However we got to the place where there was that tipping point, his life is not worth that, right? I hope we can redeem the injustice of his life being taken from him in such an unacceptable way, right? But that's the redemption work, that's how we redeem the evil of that moment, right? There was no. I think we have to be careful about the way we phrase that moment. Yes, it was a tipping point, and maybe it will lead to something good, but that was not a good moment, and there's no good in it. And we should want and pray and would have given anything for that moment not to have taken place.
For him to have his life.
For him to have his life.
Final question. With Alabama, fast forward to where we are with everything happening in the world, I always like to end these with where you see hope, where the person I'm interviewing sees hope. And it is always uplifting because people find hope in different ways. Where do you see hope?
So I see hope. This is of course, it goes back to my son. my son, his best friend is a cowboy hat, cowboy boot, Wrangler jean, big belt buckle, cowboy. My son it's interesting when he talks about it. He gets real defensive when people pick on rednecks, because his best friend is kind of a redneck kind of guy. You know, he says they're Confederates. The racist folks, that's his language. He believes they just got something messed up with them. But and they are not from the same political ideology. His best friend that he ran cross country with, that he palled around in high school with, I guarantee you, if you knew both of them separately, there is no way you would ever imagine that the two of those guys are best friends. And even though they are very different from a sense of political ideology, even though their understanding of race, racism, bigotry, bias, all those things are different, those two young men have a relationship that just gives me hope every time I see them together. And when they go to the record store, and here's the tall, dark-skinned African-American guy with dreadlocks standing next to the kid in his belt buckled and his boots and his cowboy hat, and they're palling around and talking, that just gives me hope. It leads me to believe that we are better than this and that we can get there. And so he gives me hope constantly, just constantly. He is a constant source of hope for me, because I see how resilient he is, how brave he is, how smart he is, how engaged he is, how hard he works. But to see the way that he is willing to find hope and have relationships with people that I'm not sure I would have ever picked to be some of his closest friends, I'll take that. Love it. Love that is. They've been friends for years and years, and every time they come back together from college, every time they're back in the same place, they have got to spend time together. It's remarkable.